Hey, welcome everybody. Hope everybody is healthy and happy and doing well. Hope everybody's planning for a scaled down Thanksgiving. We called off our Thanksgiving for the first time in, oh gosh, I don't know, a decade plus. We usually have all of my family in, and we banished them this year. One other program that I want to mention there's a little bit of information up on the website. We'll be getting more up soon, hopefully, is our Koten Inge program. If you like bonsai or ikebana, or just want to be introduced to a new kind of concept technique that comes from Japan on growing plants indoors, this program will be great for you. We'll kind of give it to you from a Western perspective, but Chris put that in the chat there so you can see it. It's going to be a great program. I'm really excited about it. We'll be talking about some of my favorite plants like aspidistras and rhodias and acerums and some orchids and things like that. So should be a lot of fun. And with that, I will go ahead and get started. I was a little pushed for time, so some of my intro, outro slides, we're just jumping right into it. All right, there we go. So I mentioned a word about the family, the Theaceae family. Depending on your botanist of choice, it can have around 9 genera in it, like I show here, or can have about 40 in it. Most botanists have separated out most modern botanists have separated out the Pentaphylaceae out of Theaceae. And so that's some plants like Urea and Turnstromia and Claera that I have typically thought of as part of the Theaceae. But we're just going to talk about kind of this smaller group right now. And this is the group. This just gives you a little bit of information about them. You got the Apterosperma, which is a monotypic species from subtropical China. I have never seen it. I don't know anything about it. Of course, the Camellias, that's the big one. Depending on who you talk to, 250 to 300 or 400 species. It's kind of a hard one to nail down, especially since so much breeding has been done over the years. It gets a little bit difficult, and people really didn't start studying a lot of the other species for quite a long time. But they range kind of from Eastern India, the Himalayas, Japan, and Indonesia. So overall, a really broad area. Donkia, which has another species, that's another one that I don't know anything about. Franklinia, which is our native one of our native tea plants from Georgia. It's just the one species. Gordonia, which is kind of interesting distribution. This is another one that's still kind of up in the air, but about 40 species. We've got one in the southeastern U.S., Gordonia lasianthus, which grows here in North Carolina naturally. There's one that goes Central and South America, and the way things are being discovered, especially in Central America now, I would not be surprised if we find that there are more Gordonia there that we haven't come across, and then a bunch through Southeast Asia. Some people put a lot of those Asian Gordonias into the next group, Polyspora. If you don't do that, there's about 4 to 6 species of Polyspora in Southern Asia. And then Pyrenaria, which was a fairly new genera for me to discover, sometimes also known as Tucheria, that are down there. It's really showy. Shima, with about 20 species from Nepal down all the way into the Ryukyus, which are southern islands of Japan. And then Stewartia, where mostly Southern Asia, but then we have 2 in the southeastern US, the Stewartia malacadendron and Stewartia ovata. And as I'm looking at this, I knew there was one part of my talk that I was supposed to finish up this afternoon, and I think I've left Stewartia completely out of my talk, which I didn't mean to do. But we'll have to suffer through that. Maybe we'll have one focus specifically on Stewartia later on. So the first is one of our native plants in the tea family, and that's Franklinia alatamaha. And you may know this plant. I often hear from people that this is a plant that has only been seen once in the wild. It's, some things like that, only seen by the Bartrams in the wild. That's not actually true. John and William Bartram, so John was the father and William was his son. They saw the tree, they called it a shrubby plant along the Alatamaha River back in the mid 1760s. They saw plants. It wasn't in fruit, and I don't believe they collected it until William's journeys through the early to mid 1770s. And I know they were growing it by 1777 at the Bartram house. So I wrote this down. William Bartram called it a rare and elegant flowering shrub. So he named it for Ben Franklin as a new plant. He visited it several times along the Alatamaha before they were growing it. And he said, William, who spent a lot of time traveling through the South, for 3 years, he traveled around collecting. He was paid for by John Fothergill, Fothergilla fame, another native plants that the Bartrams named for him. But he wrote about Franklinia. We never saw it grow in any other place, nor have I ever since seen it growing wild in all my travels from Pennsylvania to Point Coupe on the banks of the Mississippi, which must be allowed a very singular and unaccountable circumstance. At this place, there are 2 or 3 acres of ground where it grows plentifully. So it wasn't a single tree. The last time it was seen and confirmed in the wild was in the very early 1800s, but there's some reports that it may have persisted until 1840 and then disappeared. And nobody really knows why it disappeared, but it is susceptible to some fungal diseases, especially ones that you can pick up from cotton. So they think cotton production may have had some issues with it, which could be why sometimes it's finicky in cultivation. It's because it's growing where cotton has been grown for quite a while. So it's closely allied with Gordonia, our native Gordonia, the Asian Gordonias, but Franklinia is deciduous, whereas Gordonia is evergreen. In the wild, where the Bartrams describe it growing, it's in fairly damp areas, wet areas. If you put Franklinia in a wet area, invariably it will die. It really seems to do better in an open situation like this. It's got a real kind of odd thing about it, that in terms of its fruit production, it's got what's called zygotic dormancy. So this is in flower in late summer into fall. And the flower, it gets fertilized and has a living zygote, but then it just sits there and doesn't do anything basically all winter. And then the fruit doesn't ripen until the following summer. It just sits there. There are some tropical plants that do that, but very few temperate plants do that at all. So it's kind of a weird way of growing. So the plant that it's closest to is one of our other native tea family is Gordonia lasianthus. And you'll see the flowers on many of these other camellia relatives are very similar. White, usually with the rounded petals, not always. Sometimes they're frilly, sometimes they're notched, sometimes they're a little more pointed than rounded. But they can be very, very difficult to tell apart. And the Chinese Theaceae, if you look in the keys, it really has a lot to do with fruit structure, the seed structure, really minute details to separate the different genera from each other, not the different plants in the genera, but the different genera. Gordonia can be an absolutely beautiful tree. Gordonia lasianthus, it can get pretty big. Depending on the species, you can get flowers that range from 2 to 6 inches in diameter. Our Gordonia lasianthus is usually a good 2.5 to 3 inches at least, flowering mostly late winter into spring for most species. If it's grown out in the open, it can be just a really beautiful evergreen tree. There is a variegated form, which is very nice, and which I've actually had an easier time growing than the species quite often. But the Gordonia lasianthus is, it can be a little bit finicky getting established, but once it's established, it's usually pretty easy. I really think it's a way underutilized native tree. It's another one that when you see it growing, and if you have driven on 40, if you're here in North Carolina, but if you've driven on 40 towards Wilmington, towards the beach in late summer, you can see it flowering on the sides of the roads as you get closer to the beach. It kind of really starts flowering after the sweet bay Magnolia virginiana does, and it kind of grows in the same habitats. But again, this is another one where if I plant it in a wet spot, it does not persist for me. If I plant it in a more dry, just regular garden area, it seems to do quite well. So Tom Ranney, our NC State plant breeder, crossed Gordonia lasianthus with Franklinia and created this hybrid Gordlinia grandiflora. These flowers are sometimes 6 or 8 inches across. It's kind of a sparse plant. It isn't the most beautiful tree just because it's kind of thin, but the flowers on it are amazing, and it seems to just want to flower and flower and flower. And it roots very easily, and it grows much more easily than parents generally do. So it's a pretty cool plant. He introduced a specifics clone called Sweet Tea. I'm not sure if this one is Sweet Tea or not, but they were all fairly similar. Sweet Tea was just one that was a little bit better in a container. Now going into some of the Asian ones. I've never seen the Central American Gordonia. I believe that's Gordonia fruticosus. I don't know that one, so can't really speak about it. But the Asian ones, Gordonia axillaris is probably the most widely grown of the Asian ones. And it is, again, a beautiful tree, a beautiful evergreen tree or large shrub, the same white flowers. One interesting thing that Gordonia, many plants in the Theaceae do, is they often have these dark green leaves. And so there's some underlying red pigment in there. And the older leaves, after 2 or 3 years when they're getting ready to fall, will often turn really brilliant red. So in the late season, you can get that, and sometimes they'll persist all the way through winter like this one did. Gordonia speciosa is kind of a variable one, and a lot of Chinese botanists have separated these out. I believe in both these pictures in Chinese botanic gardens, I believe this one was labeled as Gordonia guangxiensis and this one Gordonia szechuanensis, but they've all been kind of put back into Gordonia speciosa. And Gordonia yunanensis, another one, kind of upright. And you can see with some of these Theaceae, this is new growth coming out on it is kind of red, and that'll show up again when it starts to lose those leaves. But they're all the Gordonias are all relatively similar. Polyspora, which is what a lot of the Chinese botanists have moved a lot of Gordonias into, but even the ones that haven't, there are some other polysporas. This is Longicarpa, long fruited, has kind of a sharp, long point to the fruit. And you can see it's growing. It's kind of a thin, upright tree. It'll fill out over time and become much denser. And then these flowers. And Polyspora longicarpa, one of the things I always notice when I've seen it in flower, which has only been a handful of times, is the stamens are not such a bright yellow as you get in some of the other species in these groups. But I have to admit, I'd come up and look at this or another, look at this, and I would scratch my head and say, is it a polyspora? Is it a longicarpa? Is it a Pyrenaria? Because they do get confusing. Or even, is it a camellia? Pyrenaria microcarpa, that's one of a kind of dubious taxonomic stature, that name, but this one tends to be much more open and flat when I've seen it than the Polysporas, the Pyrenarias. And the Pyrenarias can have relatively small flowers, 2 inches or so, up to ones that are 4, 5 inches. Just depending on the species. It's not a group that I'm really well familiar with at this point. And then the Shimas. Shimas are ones we've grown more, thanks in large part in the US, thanks to Camellia Forest Nursery. They have distributed a fair number of Shimas over the years. And they can be beautiful trees even without flowers. This is a young plant. I think that's quite handsome. The Shimas get large. These, in my experience, are the largest of these Theaceae plants. Shima wallichii, you can see that new growth is bright red, and then these relatively small flowers, 2 inches or so. Subspecies brevifolia. Look at these buds on this. These are flower buds that open up to these flowers. That is amazing. You can see that brevifolia. This is not really a recognized taxon, but it's so different than the typical Shima wallichii that I think you have to, maybe it could get a cultivar name. I'm not sure where it originated, but it is such a different looking plant. I have never been able to acquire this subspecies. I would really like to try it because many Shima wallichii will do just fine for us. Some of these that have kind of a range over a lot of Southern Asia, Southern China, the goal in collecting them or finding them is to get higher elevation forms, because they come down into the subtropics and even tropics. And the ones with a broader range do have the potential to do better for us. Shima superba is the one that I see most often in the wild. And I know usually in the wild that I'm seeing it when I see this on the ground, because what I'm usually standing by is a tree that it will take 3 people to put their arms around. I should look into this because I am curious. I've never looked it up, whether for some reason Shima is a bad wood, not a good wood for building things out of, because everything else will be, second or third growth forest. And then you'll have these massive Shimas that don't get cut down. And I don't know why they wouldn't be cut down unless the wood wasn't very good. But this is the fruit you get in a Shima, and it'll have these little winged seeds inside. I have collected many thousands of these from the ground because I couldn't get up there to hopefully get 1 or 2 good seeds out of. That makes them a little difficult to collect. All right, now we're going to get into something that's a little more familiar to people. And those are some of the camellias. And I just did some of the species camellias that I particularly like. I tend to like the smaller leafed ones than the large leaf ones. And that's just a personal kind of thing. But I do think that there are a lot more of these species camellias that we should be growing, and in some cases trialing out in the gardens, because they are really elegant shrubs. And it's funny, if they weren't a camellia, if they were kind of any other plant, we would be over the moon with these flowering plants. But since we have Camellia, japonicas and reticulatas that we've been breeding for centuries now, and we have these great big honking 6 or 8 inch bright red and pink doubled flowers, we tend to turn up our nose at these single flowers. But these species camellias are often showier than just about any other flowering shrub. So the first is Camellia grishii, which I first learned as sinensis, but it should rightly be grishii. There's a smaller leafed shrubbier variety called variety sinensis, and then the variety grishii, which is larger. Variety sinensis will also have smaller flowers. The flowers are more like 2.5, 3 inches, whereas grishii, they can be 4+ inches. They can grow as a tree or shrub in the wild. They go from about 4 or 5 feet tall up to maybe 12 feet. So more shrubby than some, but beautiful white flowers in spring. Really, I think a gorgeous plant. And they always have kind of this notch in the petals. There are others that do that as well, but that's one way to narrow this one down. Camellia cuspidata is another great plant in my mind. It's another most all of these are southern China, but this tends to grow more as a tree, 3 to 15 feet tall. The flowers are either produced by themselves or little groups of maybe up to 5. White petals, but often, not always, you get this kind of pink in the stamens here. So you would think with some breeding, you got some really good forms, you could get that pink into the petals if you wanted to. One of the things that happens when you have something like this with these pink inside is up close, the flowers are beautiful. From a distance, sometimes they look like they've been hit by a frost a little bit. Camellia crapnelliana, talk about a bad name for a great plant. This is maybe not the showiest in flower, but it's one of my absolute favorite camellias. So they have these singular flowers that are solitary, grown on it's typically a tree from 8 to, I don't know, 25 or 30 feet tall. But it's great because you limit up and you start showing off this bark, which just glows with this kind of orangey, cinnamony color, smooth bark. I think it's just spectacular bark. And then it forms these fruits. And these fruits, I don't have anything in there for scale, but the fruits are just shy of softball size. They are huge, and they're like cannonballs. I've seen trees with a lot of fruit on there where the branches were all just being hung down with these fruits. I would imagine that like in a bad snowstorm or something, they would crack off. We did distribute Camellia crapnelliana at one point from seeds that I had collected from a garden in Georgia. I love it. I think it's so cool. Once you go from annoying fruits to where they're just huge, weird things, they become ornamental, I think. I like it. And actually this tree or one near it had fruit on it. And this is in a garden, obviously, in Hangzhou, China. And I was there with a friend, and he saw this fruit. He's like on the ground. He's like, "What is that?" I was like, Camellia crapnelliana. And he just completely geeked out over the tree. He loved it. Now, this is an interesting guy, Camellia transnocoensis. I've grown it for many, many years. I've seen it in the wild in Taiwan, but apparently this is an valid name, but I can't figure out what the right name should be. This is one of those very small leafed camellias. This is it with new growth. You see the reddish new growth on there. The flower buds are usually pink, and then they open to white, and the flowers can be all up and down the stems. This one is one that's from Taiwan, and Flora of Taiwan has it in there, so maybe it is valid, but other resources don't seem to validate it, although I haven't delved that deeply into it. Again, a lot of these very small leafed species, I would grow these if they never flowered. I think they're just such beautiful evergreen plants that they don't even need to flower. But I also like these smaller flowers. So much of what I like in plants is the tackiest things you can find. And then I spent 10 years at Norfolk Botanic Garden where there was a massive camellia collection. It was a International Camellia Society garden of excellence, something like that, with our camellia collection. And I worked a lot with the Camellia Society, and this is not to denigrate the Camellia Society. I love all those folks, but so many of them grew plants just for camellia shows. And so they want the biggest flower they could get. And nobody seemed to appreciate these small flowered species. I think there is so much breeding work that could be done with these small leaf, small flowered ones. I think a lot of them have better forms. I just think there's so much potential there. And now that we've got our own plant breeder coming in, maybe that's somewhere we'll look into increasing cold hardiness and flower color, getting some pure colors, but there's red in there. That's a breeder looks for something like that. They're like, if there's red on the outside, I can get it into the inside. I can get that whole petal looking red. Petardii, this tends to be a tree, 9 to 25 plus feet tall. This species goes from white to pink to red. I've never actually seen the red form. I would like to, but again, I think that's just beautiful flowers. And this one tends to flower solitary, just one flower. Sometimes they're paired, but usually just one flower. But it gets to be big. Camellia lutuensis. This is the species. Camellia lutuensis is one of my all-time favorites. I've grown that for many years. This variety minutiflora is on my wish list. So if anybody sees this, pick one up from me. This is usually shrub, can grow from 6 to maybe as tall as 15 or 18 feet. This is one of those ones with a wide distribution, Camellia lutuensis. It goes, southern China, but Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan. So it can really spread. Tends to be mostly, the flowers are held, there's a lot of flowers in a cluster, but they tend to only open in those clusters individually. But you can see a lot of these best forms, that new growth is really beautiful red. Now, this is the only form of variety minutiflora I've ever seen. And I'm wondering this is so weeping. Camellia lutuensis grows upright. The branches kind of hang down like this, but when you're in a botanic garden, you don't want to go digging too deep into the middle of the plant. I was trying to see if maybe something had been killed, like broken off in the center, because lutuensis usually does grow up, not quite this weepy, but I don't know about variety minutiflora. They don't mention that in any of the keys I've seen. Camellia saluensis, another one that I've grown a fair amount, but never one that was this nice with this great color coming out. This is another one that flower color can go from white to red. This is a nice pink one, but you have these pink flowers and you barely even see them because the foliage is so nice. And it's a shrub, 3 to 12 feet or so generally. And this one I think this one's been pruned, which I think is the right thing to do with many camellias, especially these ones that have the great foliage, because they can be kind of open otherwise. But here's more saluensis with this pale pink flower color. And Camellia forestii, I've never even seen this one in flower, but it supposedly has white clustered flowers. But look at this growth the new growth on there. Again, would never have to have a flower. And this is just from Yunnan and Vietnam kind of area. So I'm not sure about hardiness, but it's worth a shot for sure. But man, that is gorgeous. And finish up with a tree, Camellia henriana, variety Trichocarpa. This tends to be a tree, not necessarily huge, but 10 to 25 feet, tends to want to go up one stem more than be multi-stem like a lot of the other ones. It has these white solitary flowers and that reddish new growth. This is it in spring, early spring, late winter, early spring, and looking beautiful. So that is it for now. Before I get to your questions, let's take a look at what's on the plant cart. So on our plant sale buggy tomorrow, we'll have our giant Ardesia, which is great. Ardesia is one of the plants that we do in our Coton Inge, and the JCRA has what is certainly the largest collection in the United States of Ardesia japonica that we'll be showing off with our Coton Inge. The great Carex oceanensis everillo. This is one that at our symposium on Saturday, Dan Benarsic talked about how great this chartreuse grass is. Great epimedium, Fronleiten. This is one of the old stalwarts of epimediums, fairy wings, bishop's caps, whatever you want to call it. This is one that's been reliably grown for decades and decades. There's a lot of new stuff coming out, but sometimes you can't beat the good old stuff, that evergreen foliage, these spring yellow flowers. Although, as I always say with epimediums that are evergreen, it doesn't mean the foliage looks great by the end of the winter. So by about midwinter, January, February, cut all the foliage back, and then you'll get the flowers come up without any foliage in the way, and new flowers a new foliage will come up after that. A little dwarf fig, edible fig, Little Miss Figgy. A few irises. We have Iris nata that you can do in some shade. It does spread to form like a ground cover, so keep that in mind. Iris tectorum. I believe this is the one, this may be one that I collected in China. We have that growing here, but I had it at home, and it's the most vigorous roof iris I've ever come across. And so I dug a bunch up and brought it back in. So I think that might be it. Iris yasha. This is a sudata, so it's crossed between Pseudacarus, the yellow, sometimes almost weedy yellow flag iris, and then the Japanese irises, which can be a little temperamental. So this is a really good form. It likes moist soil. So very good one. So this is what happens when you get 3 plant people together. Tim, Doug, and I were all looking at plants that were going out on the cart, and we have these little platyclatus, Oriental arborvitaes. And Tim said nobody's going to buy these because they're just like a fan of foliage. And I said, hell, they should buy them. And Doug was like, I know, I propagated them because I love this plant so much. And then Tim pipes up, I love platyclatus. And we all think this is a great plant. Looks terrible in a pot, but it ultimately forms this really just beautiful, a little bit kind of bright yellow when it first comes out, this Beverlyensis, but a great one. And then autumn glow toad lily with that gold edge around it, and then the late season purple blooms. So great collection of plants on the plant cart. Always amazed that my crew keeps plants on there to go on there, because we have gone through some plants this year. We've been closed, and we've distributed more plants this year than any other year.
Before we get too far away from the plant buggy, Rachel just asked, do any of the irises that you mentioned flower more than once? I don't believe they did.
No, these are not any kind of reblooming irises. Though we do sometimes have reblooming ones, but not these, yeah.
And I was asked privately, they said Dr. William Ackerman did a fair amount of camellia breeding using Camellia oleifera,
Oleifera, yeah.
And I was wondering if there have since been found hardier species that might be useful in breeding super hardy camellias. He's writing in from Northern Virginia.
So yeah, that's a good thought. So there's been some hardiness breeding, certainly with Camellia oleifera. If you're ever going to ask me what the most cold hardy camellia is, I will say Camellia oleifera. And it's a beautiful plant. I didn't put it in here. I could have. It's got great bark, kind of like that Crapnelliana. It's really nice when it gets big and you limb it up, and then the white flowers, and it's a really nice plant. JC, back in the mid 80s with Barry Yinger and folks from the National Arboretum and other places, went to Korea to collect camellias from the farthest north they could find them in Korea. And so that's brought those plants have been used in breeding hardiness into camellias as well. But oleifera is probably, as far as I know, is the most cold hardy that we have. I knew somebody who was growing them they had a small little greenhouse, and what they were doing is they were taking drain tile and the terracotta tile pipe. They were growing Camellia oleifera in there with the goal of getting roots all the way down to the bottom. So they had something really deep rooted, and then they were going to plant that. They were going to dig a deep hole, put it in there, crack the drain tile. I don't know if that actually worked or not, but yeah, oleifera is certainly the hardiest of them all.
I think you just answered 2 questions in one, which is great. Marilyn has asked or commented that she has a Gordlinia sweet tea that she purchased in February in a 5-gallon pot. She also commented it's been flowering all summer and then well
Yeah.
into the fall. She was wondering, does she need to get it in the ground before it gets too cold this winter, or will it do okay in a half whiskey barrel?
I would think it would be okay. It's certainly zone 6 hardy.
Yeah.
Tom Randy's growing it outside up in the mountains. So I would think it would be fine unless we have, you know, it might be early to break bud. So if we get a warm spell and then it drops back down, kind of in the middle of the winter, that could be a problem.
Yep. And Lori, one of our most favorite questions, where can she get some of these camellias and her relatives that you've talked about?
So Camellia Forest Nursery certainly is a place, especially for the camellias. I have seen some of these relatives at Forest Farm before, also Far Reaches. We occasionally have them. We had some in our rare plant auction this weekend, some Polysporas and Pyrenarias. Garden Treasures has some of the species camellias. I don't know if they have anything that Camellia Forest won't have. I don't know. They're kind of hard to come by. There's some of the folks down in the south may grow some of them. Bobby Green, now he's a wholesale nursery, and he may have shut down. I don't know. Every once in a while, I'm surprised. I'll go into a little mom and pop place down in the deep south, Alabama, kind of, and they'll have weird Polysporas and Shimas.
Okay, here's another one I wasn't able to answer, but I think I may have gotten enough online, but we'll see. Laurie asked, how fast does Shimas grow?
How fast do Shimas grow? They grow pretty quickly. Once let's say you plant it and it's been in the ground for 2 years. After that, I think you would easily get 12 to 24 inches of growth. Yeah, it'll probably sit for a year or two.
Okay. And I'm trying to find, here's Kathy's question. Kathy asked, where was the photograph taken of the Franklinia that you showed in the first slide? Do you remember?
Hold on. I don't even remember the picture. Oh, that's Norfolk Botanic Garden.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's some people talking about the fruit on the Camellia. Where I first saw it in fruit, there is a garden down in coastal Georgia called Armstrong Atlantic University or something like that. And they have an amazing plant collection there. Amazing plant collection. It really is. And no horticulture program. They just have their head of grounds likes cool plants. And so they have all kinds of really neat things.
We have a non-camellia related question. Someone planted a Kentucky coffee tree very recently, and it's waving in the wind. Does she need to stake it?
All right. If the root ball isn't moving, don't stake it. When trees move in the wind, they create reaction wood, tension wood, and that makes the tree stronger. If you're afraid that it is actually rocking that root ball, you can stake it, but even when you stake it, you don't want to stake it rigid. You want to stake it so it can move some. You'll wind up with a much stronger tree ultimately. Goal is to not stake trees if you can. That should be the goal.
And I had a private comment that woodlanders in South Carolina could be a good source for some of these.
Yes, woodlanders could, and a lot of that stuff from Armstrong Atlantic came from woodlanders. I don't know if they've gotten they seem to kind of cycle through the types of plants. For a while, they were doing a lot of camellias, and they kind of stepped away from that for a while, but I haven't looked at their lists in quite a while.
And I believe that's the end of the questions. I don't see anything that we haven't covered.
All right. Well, any other questions while I have y'all on here?
Wanted to know how the plant sale went.
Oh, how the auction go? It went fantastic. People bid fast and furious. Which got enable us to distribute a lot of plants. We'll see. They haven't gotten their plants yet, so hopefully they're not upset with us with what they get. But we do put pictures of the actual plants they're getting in most cases in the pictures, so they can see exactly what they're getting. But yeah, no, it went really well. And the symposium that was along with it was fantastic.
Could you say a little more about the Camellia Greciae in terms of, it looked like the one you showed was out in right much sun, and does it bloom? How early in spring does it bloom?
It's not real early. It's kind of mid-spring. It's one of the later camellias to bloom. It's generally well after the japonicas are finished. You sometimes, I'm gonna put this in the chat so you can see it. You'll sometimes see it as sinensis, and I did not mix up the Y and the H. I mean the H and the S there. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you'll see it like that in the trade. It's a great plant, and it's one that it was. I'm not going to say hardy like Camellia oleifera, but a lot of the species camellias are pretty tender, and that one was always a good species. I would say it's solid 7B easily. I'm really hoping, talking about camellias, I'm really hoping I've got a Camellia grandiflora planted at my house, which is from Hong Kong, but supposedly has hardiness in it. It was at one point down to one plant in the wild, and it was described by the first head of horticulture at Norfolk Botanic Garden, where I used to work. And for years, I tried to find the plant and never could find it. And I finally tracked it down. So I'm hoping to see a flower on that one, but I don't know. It may not be hardy here. But it's one of those things. I looked everywhere for it, and then it wound up with a friend of mine who has a nursery, had it. Which Nurseries Caroliniana sometimes has some species camellias sometimes. They're the ones who had Camellia grandiflora, not for sale, but he had a few going.
We did get another question about camellias. They would like to know what's the best time of the year for pruning camellias.
Best time of year for pruning camellias. Well, the best time of year to prune them is winter, but you don't want to do that because of the flowering. I generally prune them after they finish blooming. I like to get like the ones that are flowering over the winter. If you prune after they're finished, then they don't form seed, so that no energy goes into that. If they've got nice foliage, they flush out in the spring if they've got nice new growth. So that's kind of when I do it. But you can prune them and not lose flowering on most of them up through midsummer. I wouldn't prune them much past mid-July, but you can do that. You can do it then.
Cool.
Yeah.
No more questions in the chat, Mark.
No more questions in the chat. All right. Excellent. Well, I hope y'all all have a good Thanksgiving. I won't see y'all next week, so you have to go to the YouTube channel and watch something old on there. Chris has plenty of stuff made from way back, so that'll tide you over until December.
I don't know. I may go into withdrawal.
Well, Linda, you just get in touch with me. We'll Zoom together no matter what. So, and then consider that Coatninge program. We just have kind of a nominal cost to it just to cover some expenses. I think it's going to be a really neat program. I think it's going to introduce people to completely kind of a different aspect of growing plants indoors, and it will certainly give you something to think about other than the fact that you're not going to any holiday parties this year. So I hope to see you then, but thank y'all all for coming.
Thank you for a great presentation, Mark, and thanks for joining us, everyone.
Yep. Thank y'all.
See you in a couple weeks.